Hello and welcome to the latest Urban Manifesto webinar. I'm Lucy Bullivant, the founder of urbanista.org, my webzine for livable urbanism, and together with Prathima Manohar, the founder of the Think Do Tank Urban Vision, we have created the Urban Manifesto, which is a third online platform that we have put together during lockdown for your entertainment and education. We were prompted to do this because the pandemic and the demands of transitioning into a new era have brought up really profound questions concerning the identities, policies, and processes of urban design and planning. So I'm delighted to tell you that today's theme is well-being and happiness in the built environment, health being uppermost in everyone's minds at the moment. Prathima's going to introduce the theme along with our two splendid guests in less than a minute. But let me just quickly run you through the way this works. So what we do when we kick off, so for Urban Manifesto, what we do is we invite each of our two expert guests who are chosen from across different continents or disciplines or backgrounds, or even from the same city as in the case of today. And they present their 3-minute manifesto of 3 priorities for action to create a happier, healthier, more livable, and that means more equitable urban future. And then we explore the issues in a Q&A, after which we invite you, our audience, to ask our guests questions. Through meeting the challenges brought about by the pandemic, through learning and through unlearning old ways which have really lost their relevance or which are downright unhelpful in the 21st century, our manifesto will be a real roadmap for progressive, resilient and responsible urban change. A shout out to our partner, the Architecture Foundation, for live streaming each episode as part of its ongoing 100-day studio program. So thanks, and over to you, Prathima.
Thank you, Lucy. Welcome to the Urban Manifesto. Today's theme is well-being and happiness in the built environment. We often look at health and well-being from purely from the point of view of science and medicine, but there's growing evidence that the world of design and architecture plays an enormous role, not just in the quality of our life, but our health as well. So we are so delighted to have our two guests who worked extensively in this space. Bruce Haden, architect and co-founder of the Human Studio, and Viren Kallianpur, associate principal of urban design at Perkins and Will, Vancouver. Thank you both for joining us. How have you been during this crazy time that the world's been going through, Bruce?
It's been good. We have 2 young children, and it's been. I would have to say that trying to run an architecture practice and manage 2 young children has been incredibly difficult. And my wife actually started a new job during the pandemic, which was amazing. But that's been a struggle, and we're extremely glad in this part of the world because it does look like the elementary schools, the younger grades are going to open full time in the fall, which will be a huge relief.
Viren, how have you been?
Yeah, it's truly unprecedented times, working from home, managing multiple things, very similar to what Bruce mentioned. But at the same time, I feel this is a great opportunity to kind of recalibrate our thinking towards cities. Yeah.
No, I think we both agree. Lucy and I created this platform because we agree that this is a moment of great disruption and great reset. And I hope post the pandemic era, we will see more investments into well-being and sustainability, which is the theme that we're going to address today. And we've asked both of you to prepare a manifesto for the future of cities and built environment, but from the perspective of well-being and health. Bruce, what is your 3-point agenda for the future of built environment in cities from the perspective of well-being and health? I have your slides up as well.
Thank you, Prathima. I appreciate the intro. We're going to do 5 introductory slides from an upcoming Instagram project that we're doing at Human Studio called Human Studio Futures. And our goal is to explore the possibilities of life after the pandemic. So the first slide you can see is a really simple one. And the statement that we want to make is, if we rebuild our cities to respond to the pandemic, more people will die. And the reason is that the pressure will be on to foster social distancing, to de-densify, and to support cars as opposed to public transit. Next slide. But it's critical to remember that social isolation kills as many people as smoking, which is way more deaths than COVID-19. Next slide. And air pollution and auto accidents kill more than 15,000 people a year in Canada, and many places in the globe are much worse than this on a per capita basis. Next slide. And people in compact cities walk more, are skinnier, and live longer. So let's have more alive people close together with more bikes and fewer cars, and this will mean fewer dead people. And this is a plea to not abandon the virtues of progressive urbanism in the face of pandemics current and future. But a pandemic is only one type of global risk. We're experimenting with destructive populism, massive species destruction, huge migrations, and most terrifying of all, the climate catastrophe. My first manifesto point is that we cannot respond successfully to these and other challenges if we are not talking to each other. The unnecessary COVID disaster unfolding in the United States is proof of this. Architecture and urban design have a role to play in supporting social ties, and strong social ties help build resilience. My last 2 manifesto points are how our small Canadian architecture practice is responding to the challenge of creating a built environment that encourages sociability. First, at the urban scale, we've just released a book written with my co-authors Mark Holland and Bruce Urban called Urban Magnets, which suggests the possibility of an urban design built around passionate inhabitation of the city, a people-focused design rather than a form-focused design. Second, at the building scale, we are working with the support of the American Robert Woods Johnson Public Health Foundation and BC Housing, our local provincial housing agency, to build agent-based software to understand how building designs influence sociability. Our goal is to build virtual buildings like one would in a video game, populate those buildings with digital agents, and understand through comparative analysis of options how design can help foster people talking to each other. And people who talk to each other are happier, healthier, and make better citizens. Thank you.
Oh. Oops.
Hi, this is Viren. The current pandemic is truly disruptive. As I said, I believe really it's made us to kind of reset and recalibrate and rethink our approach, strategies, and priorities. As I said, this is a great opportunity, a catalyst to stop doing wrong things and do things better. One thing that we can do better is really creating healthy, happy, inclusive, equitable, and resilient cities, as Lucy had mentioned previously. So when one thinks about well-being in a holistic way, there are different aspects of well-being. I think about 9 aspects: physical, environmental, financial, intellectual, social, spiritual, cultural, and occupational, and emotional. While each person may have different needs and thought processes, each of these, albeit in different proportions, are required for holistic well-being. In absence of or limitations of any can cause discomfort and stress, resulting in impact and well-being. So while I have multiple thoughts for the Urban Manifesto, I'd like to share 3 agendas for the manifesto. Next slide, please. So the first one was connect and extend. So let's really make more connections and extend our efforts, resources, and efforts to uphold equity, and livability. So while social distancing and physical separation really separates people, let's make communities stay connected and united. Let's make mixed neighborhoods. We talk about 20-minute neighborhoods with all amenities and facilities within walking or biking distance, so people are not really forced to jump onto a car. Let's extend our resources and amenities and plan and evolve cities in an equitable way, ensuring equal opportunities and really creating conditions for success for vulnerable populations, whether it's Black, the indigenous people, people of color, vulnerable minorities. Let's recognize that a city is an extension of the living room for many of us and diverse people. So let's ensure activity, vibrancy, opportunities, and choices for diverse people. Next slide, please. Let's be generous with our planning, resources, and how we really create a framework for the cities to evolve and process. We all know that the future of cities is shared. Resources are on demand basis, whether it's Netflix, Airbnb, car sharing, or even WeWork. While sharing is caring, we need to follow behavioral protocols to ensure space is comfortable and safe for all. The other aspect of that is just offering choices for people, really creating flexible spaces and homes to enable work from home or opportunities for people for upward mobility in their career or lifestyles. Let's create richer and more comfortable public spaces that have more redundancy, that are flexible and responsive to changing needs. To be wider sidewalks for social distancing in pandemic, or set up pop-up program spaces to transform and create richer public life. Let's reallocate our intellectual and financial resources to prioritize active transportation and transit over automobile to create more healthy communities. The next slide, please. Next slide.
No, I think we have only three slides. That was the.
I think the last one is the last one was let's be one with nature. And
okay.
Indigenous communities really did not differentiate between people and nature. It was really a very symbiotic relationship and dependence. With modern science, we have really started to either dominate or alter to control the natural processes or negatively impact. So we need to really recalibrate and be one with nature, become stewards of the environment, really creating healthier future for both people and planet.
Thank you, Viren, for that Urban Manifesto. I think the idea about nature being crucial to well-being is well taken, especially at this point in time where we've all recognized that in some ways we are seeing a rise in the era of pandemics because of biodiversity loss. So thank you both for those important points. Lucy?
Yeah, thank you very much. Very thoughtful and holistic, of course, as we would hope, because everything is interconnected and interdependent. So I think you covered an awful lot of ground in 3 manifesto points. I know it's quite a challenge to marshal one's thoughts into just 3 points, but so I think I'm going to address sometimes we ask one mega question to both speakers, but I think we'll kick off with 2 bespoke questions to Bruce, to each of you, Bruce and then Viren. So Bruce, you maintain quite understandably, and we totally agree, that it's important to think about all 3 facets of health and well-being equally: mental, social, and physical, contributing to social well-being at the city scale. So could you tell us a little bit more about your recent work around social well-being and design, quality enabling this kind of vision in reality, reinventing urban sociality and vitality through what we can understand as very bespoke rather than a generic urban design strategies. And you mentioned your brand new book, Urban Magnets, which flags up a lot of these points. So we're really fascinated to hear a bit more about this.
So we're working on the 2 initiatives. The Urban Magnets initiative really focuses on the idea that that, well, it came out of the analysis of a place in Vancouver called Granville Island, which had been one of those places with a public market. It is an old historic industrial area that had been converted with a fresh food market and an arts district. And even though it's had some struggles in recent years, it's actually been very successful for over 40 years now. And there was a period after it was built in North America, certainly. I always think it's important to contextualize these when the urban lessons that I can respond to are really the lessons of my own culture, which I really consider to be kind of the United States and Canada in its simple terms. So I don't want to make sure, I always want to make sure not to generalize into every conceivable culture, because I think there are very different solutions. But anyway, Granville Island came around and had been extremely successful in a bunch of different ways. And then one of the things that happened was that there were a bunch of knockoff Granville Islands, which essentially put a fresh food market on a waterfront. And almost all of them in this particular part of the world failed. And we were extremely curious about what the characteristics of Granville Island were successful over time. And we came up with what we think of the ideas on urban magnets are places where people can really express their passions in concrete ways. And so Granville Island, for example, has, and we identified five components that we think are really important. One is retail. You do need to be able to shop, and that's often the economic basis of the thing. The second is education, and education can be formal, like a post-secondary institution, but it can be cooking classes. The third is programming, facility programming, and the opportunity to have events associated with particular activities. I'll make this more clear in a moment. Then there's fabrication, the actual making of things. One of the things that's been taken out of our inner cities is fabrication, because of the whole highest and best use theory. And we think fabrication is visible fabrication is essential to authenticity. And the last is the physical space, the public realm. So when we looked at Granville Island, we recognized that the Granville Island had three magnets that had all of these things. It had a food magnet, a boating magnet, an arts and culture magnet. You can even argue there was both a visual arts magnet and a performing arts magnet. And it had all of those things. You could buy art, you could learn about art, you could, the public realm was full of art-focused events. So too often, when we think of of urban design as architects, we tend to fall very, very quickly into what does it look like? And so, for example, I think all of the cities I actually believe across the world, are littered with kind of modernist plazas, for example, that are completely inactive because they simply focus on the availability of space as opposed to how people will inhabit that space. And our core position here is that we want to see people being passionate about whatever they're doing, and that is core to creating a sense of sociability in the urban realm.
Fantastic, thank you. So the bespoke question for Viren is very much to ask you to enlarge a little bit on recent work. Is it very much the case that Perkins and Will's work in design, adhering to very high standards in well-being and resilience, it also adheres to a decidedly modernist agenda? And maybe one project that you can think of to show us and tell us how these things are reflected.
Yeah, thank you. I think while there are health-related, best practices and design standards and certifications, we typically, we don't prescribe to one. So, for example, lead well, fit well, living building challenge. There is a conscious effort to do actually the right things with sustainability and regeneration and resilience standpoints. As you know, there are certain limitations for each of the standards. For example, LEED, it addresses on-site green spaces, but basic walkability and public transit access could be improved. Well emphasizes the building itself, tends to focus less on the importance of neighborhood and connectivity, while in a living building challenge, on the other hand, has requirements promoting car-free living, biophilia, or on-site agriculture. And last but not the least, FitWill has a focus on active design. And then the reason I'm bringing this up is I think the effort is not to approach. I mean, the effort is to approach this in a more holistic manner, leveraging these different standards and not necessarily being limited by a particular certification. So I think at least our approach is, thinking through a systems standpoint, looking at how things are connected. And often we really persevere to have things serve more than one intended purpose. For example, if it's like a pocket park that you're talking about, how do you actually create a really active retail and program edges that could bring environmental, social, whether it's financial, emotional, cultural aspects to it, and well-being. Depending on how the spaces are designed and programmed. In terms of a specific project as such, I think it's again on urban design and planning aspect. Most of the projects that we are doing are related again to from a system standpoint, kind of connecting. So we have worked on a project here in Coquitlam. It's called Fraser Mills. Again, just thinking about how public realm actually really helps to, uphold well-being and a sense of community. From another project that I can think about is a project that you're working currently in Brentwood. It's really a high-density environment, living environment, and we're really focusing a lot on the public realm. How do we balance livability and density? And again, that's a huge challenge. At least in this part of the world, you're facing where you need to have higher density for multiple reasons, but at the same time, how do we balance health and well-being and in the same time?
Fantastic. That's really interesting. Also, that you flag up the systems approach, which I think is really, really relevant. And it's, as a phrase, it sounds maybe a little bit suspicious, but believe me, I think, these are benign systems that we're talking about, aren't they? I mean, perhaps somebody should think of some other way of describing it. Maybe the equivalent of, say, urban magnets. I don't know. I'm just thinking off the top of my head.
I agree. I think I just want to re-emphasize that I think the road to recovery post this pandemic must be based on health, well-being, and sustainability. And that requires us to radically reimagine our built environments. So they don't just strengthen the immediate kind of needs of this pandemic, but also serve as a platform for long-term health. So I want to ask both of you, how can we make a case about the positives and benefits of that approach of integrating diverse form of well-being and wellness into design of not just built environment, but also cities? And how, if we were to start, Bruce, how should we define this idea of healthy building and a healthy city? Bruce, you're muted.
Sure, I did it the wrong way. I unmuted, was a mute. So, well, I think what Viren was talking about in my mind was a very comprehensive spread of the idea of health, which I think is extremely important, because obviously it's physical health, mental health, and social health. I think one of the problems in design is that these have often been talked about in a way that's actually somewhat generic. So the example that I use, so if we contrast, for example, the sustainability conversation, one of the ways I describe it, and it's had many, many different stages over the last, there's in different stages in different places. But, kind of at the time that I started my career about 30 years ago, there was suddenly a kind of upsurge in interest. And at that time, people said, well, if we have solar panels and non-toxic paints, then we've got a green building. And then subsequent to that, and Viren mentioned many of these, there was a whole series of kind of standards that start to evolve. And you can be critical of those standards, but the fundamental question, what makes a green building, needed to be understood in a different way. And I think we need to think more rigorously and with an evidence basis of what makes a healthy city. So, for example, one of the other collaborators, who is someone you should also interview, by the way, is Larry Frank of UBC. who works, and Larry's kind of tagline is he can tell how long you're going to live by where you're going to live, where you live. So he, for example, has measured the relationship between obesity and diabetes in suburban areas. So in simple terms, if you live in a suburban area and have to drive everywhere, you will tend to eat worse food and not exercise enough, and you will die more quickly. And he's actually been able to quantify this at multiple scales. He did some work in the West End, a downtown neighborhood of Vancouver, where he's able to quantify the physical benefits of a new greenway in absolutely rigorous terms. And I think that kind of work is really important as we move into this step, because we have to decide, it's great to say good things, but I think in terms of, it's like the healthcare system anywhere, we have to start to say, we have not an endless pot of money. Where is the best place to spend that money? And historically, what we're talking about in urban design is really responding to chronic conditions as opposed to emergency conditions. And our health system, for example, is really good at responding to emergency conditions and bad at responding to chronic conditions. So for us, what we're taking on is this idea of that we want to get much more rigorous about what is it in the urban environment and in the building environment that supports sociability, and how do we start to understand that? And some of it is obviously cultural. I mean, one of the reasons we're trying to do comparative analysis of building designs using agent-based modeling is that we know that the culture of Portugal and the culture of Vancouver and the culture of India and the culture of London are all going to actually have different expectations about human communication. But what we want to try to do is to understand what part of those are connected to the way we design our physical environment, And some of it is really obvious, but not measured particularly effectively. Like, it's obvious that a noisy street is going to be less supportive of conversation than a quiet street. But do we know, for example, what that threshold is? I don't. So I think what I'm really kind of arguing for is to try to start to unpack the specific components of wellness and understand them in an evidence-based way and find the ways that they connect.
I think that's such an important point, Bruce. If you could measure some of the health implications and impacts of the built environment, we'll start investing a lot more into sustainability or well-being. Viren, what about you? How do we, think about this big idea of a healthy built environment and city?
Yeah, I mean, I really like the way Bruce framed it. I think it's about more context driven. There are these holistic big ideas, but how do we put it together that's more context driven? Every city, every community, every place that we touch has a different memory, has a different sensitivity to it. So I would say maybe I can talk a little bit about the design process that may kind of help and address both your question and a response to the earlier one. While we start thinking about cities are pretty complex and adaptive systems, right? Like Lucy mentioned early on. So every project that we typically start is we brainstorm with the values with stakeholders, right? So I think it's more thinking about what's the context you are working with, and thinking about what the goals are, and essentially that creates, for want of a better word, the DNA for the project. That really helps us to develop a framework through systems thinking processes. Then we use these different variables that we generate to either analyze through multi-factor evaluation. So, for example, if to what Bruce was saying, if things have really worked well in Granville, and you're thinking about other places where it doesn't work, I think that's the important thing to kind of identify what are the underlying context, how things are related. So, essentially, again, thinking about performance-based design or evidence-based kind of design, we try to kind of create, different, I would say, like parameters, and find sweet spots where potential score. Do it in a way it's really will be really studied more in detail. So the whole point is that it's not necessarily a solution. I think that the future of a city, I think it's kind of really helping to create a more robust and a strong framework, on which the city can evolve to becoming more, I would say, more resilient, more equitable, and also upholding the health and well-being of both people and the planet. Sometimes, we miss the planet part of it. Sometimes we miss the people part of it. But I think it's how we actually connect the two.
I think you make that point of the connection between sustainability, environment, and well-being very well. And I think it's so linked. And maybe post this pandemic, we need to focus on the health side because it's so connected to all of our lives, right? Like if you lived in Mumbai, a child that grows up in Mumbai or Delhi has 40% lower lung capacity. And built environment and design of your cities, is directly responsible for that. So I think speaking the language of the more, of health, maybe will allow us to drive home the message of climate change and sustainability even more. Lucy?
Yeah, and also life expectancies as well. Definitely, to add to that point that you just made. So as Viren has acknowledged, we've all acknowledged, the job of cities are complex systems, and accordingly, the job of designing and regenerating and developing them is a job of truly multidisciplinary teams. More so now, I think we recognize that now more so than ever before, extending into behavioral science and goodness knows what else. So my question is really, how can the multidisciplinary design expertise that we're talking about, how can it drive our creativity and our performance and productivity, covering the parts of our lives that aren't spent, let's say, in leisure activity? And all of this is part of resilience too, as well as our sense of connection and community. Because some people like to see the parts of our lives as, we are either leisure activities involved in those, or we are working. Yes. But creativity really has to run through everything. So how can multidisciplinary design enhance our creativity and productivity?
Well, that was quite a long question, Lucy. I got to try to.
Yeah, I'm famous for that. Yes. So, Bruce,
do you want to take a first crack at this one, and I'll think about it?
All right, sure. I'll try to do justice to the question. So, I would say there are different facets to the question, or different aspects. Maybe I'll look at one aspect of it, and in many ways I feel from a multidisciplinary approach standpoint, it's important to create a baseline that everyone understands, and again working with whether it's the client, the community, or the stakeholders, establishing a common baseline, what we are almost like project ethos, things that you really want to create. That's important. And one aspect of that I can say, or I can think about immediately, that comes to my mind is really creating flexible spaces, offering choices, for people, recognizing that there are people from different choices they need, or different thought process they have, their different priorities. And especially when you're thinking about like the public realm versus a built project that is meant for a certain target audience, it's even more important for urban design and planning, where we beyond the public space being used by multiple people, it's also the future of it. Things need to evolve and kind of grow and transform. And I think the ability for really people to share ideas and feel empowered really helps to create a wider connection beyond just the built environment, and really create those meaningful connections with a larger community. I think the culture of sharing and open discussion, and Lucy, you talked about creativity and performance. I think it's really creating conditions of success. And I think in many ways I feel like conditions of success is more, I think, empowering people. You can empower people by creating choices, giving them choices, so you're not kind of honing them in a certain direction and you're forcing them. And that relates back to both built environment and open spaces. I don't know whether that answers your question, Lucy.
Oh yes, absolutely. Because at the heart of it is you want the clients to apply the finest intelligence concerning programs in the first place, and if that can appear in the brief, an awareness that our spaces are used in so many different versatile ways these days. We don't want to be programmed. We need to be programmed up to a certain extent. We want to feel, let's say, that sense of freedom within the forms of the built environment. Talking about, multi-use facilities, whether that's, the humane, slightly more domestic feel of an office space, or it's a extremely, a cultural centre where there's a myriad of community uses. And now we need to have something a little bit loose fit, although I think loose fit is used by architects in London, but I don't know that's quite the right word either. Anyway, so yeah, Bruce, have you had time?
I'm actually gonna take a different and slightly contradictory perspective. So I'm going to start with the question about collaboration fundamentally, which to me is that bringing different perspectives to play. And I think it's actually interesting. I always like to go back. If you think of the sort of Eurocentric history of architecture, architecture has always been seen as a fundamentally visual art. And so and that has strong implications. So the implication of that is that one of the core values of architecture, which I do agree with, is beauty. But it's kind of like architecture is just bigger sculpture that you move around in, is a kind of a slightly cynical perspective. So one of the things that I've done throughout my career is always think that my role as an architect is actually much more akin to choreography than to visual art. And so one could argue that dance is a visual art, but in the sense that one of the fundamental aspects of choreography is that it is human centric, which I think is important. But the other characteristic is you actually have to work with collaborators. Like a painter can sit in a studio and do absolutely nothing other than paint. And of course, many great painters have many collaborators, but you understand the distinction. Whereas if you think about choreographing a dance company, like say I've got a group of stakeholders, that group of stakeholders is going to be able to move in a particular direction in a particular way. And so this is akin to the dancers. Part of my job is to take the energies and passions of both the client and the collaborators. Sometimes it might be a city, sometimes it might be a private developer, all of these things, and bring them into a kind of higher artistic and health-based meaning. Right. So if the first thing I think is it's important actually to shift in my mind away from a visual arts historical perspective, which I think many architects carry. The second thing is I'm actually going to challenge a little bit the idea that the city, one of the aspects of city making is that it's become in many cases more generic in response to this idea that the city should kind of be for everybody at any time. And when I actually look at the historical cities that I love, the historical cities that I love have often had places that are actually very specific, like a waterfront that's based on the choreography of fishing boats coming in and out, a meatpacking district, a craft brewing district, those sorts of things. And so for me, it's actually important to prioritize and say that this part of the city isn't actually about trying to keep everybody happy. Because I think that part of what we want to do is that it's a bit like having a conversation. We don't want conversations where we're all saying the same thing and we're all agreeing. We want conversations where we're visibly caring about the things that are important to us, and we have respect from other people for those things, and we're able to listen to other people. So for me, that's the way that I think of the city, rather than a place that's kind of too often thought of as flat, which is very easy arrived at when you think about everybody being welcome everywhere at any time. I'm not talking about not making people welcome, by the way. People should always be welcome. But the kind of prioritization, let's have an area of the city that's really awesome for skateboarders. And maybe that isn't going to make my mother happy, and she's not going to go to that neighborhood. But that's going to be an awesome part of the city for them. And I do think that kind of way of thinking about the city is different, and it can often easily be thought of as exclusionary. It's fundamentally not. It's celebratory, not exclusionary.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's a really great point. And we're going to be hopefully speaking to the city architect of Copenhagen, Camilla van Ders, in a few weeks' time. And she's implemented a number of brilliant tactical urbanism projects for every single age group and every people of all backgrounds and and groups to enjoy the city equally, but not all at the same time in the same place. I guess that's an allied philosophy that she's applied there, hopefully. It seems like that. Anyway, Prathima.
Yeah, speaking about cities, a whole array of factors contribute to well-being and health from a city scale. And if you were to think about design, and if we were to think about nudging the community towards sustainable and healthier choices, what are the principles and design techniques we can use to push for more healthier and sustainable life choices?
Mm-hmm.
Who wants to start?
Let's start with this one, Viren.
Viren?
You can go ahead, Bruce.
So I think there are a number of things. One is I actually think city governments need to be a bit braver. Because all of us are absolutely creatures of habit, right?
Right.
And so, for example, we won't accept or support things that we've never seen before. So this is an overused example, but I think it's such a cogent one. When Jeanette Sari-Khan was working, I don't know whether I'm pronouncing her name correctly, was working under Mayor Bloomberg in New York City and instituted a whole series of bike lanes. And one of the things that they did is they did them very quickly. And, with very simple things like paint lines. And, this was, I think, a great model for what happened during the pandemic, where people just said, maybe we don't need all these parking spaces. And so I think that there's often, it's exactly the same way that we kind of don't know what's good for us. And that can sound like an arrogant, sort of professional, overbearing attitude. But sometimes it's also true in the same sense as if you give people the choice to say, well, I want to drive in my comfortable car with my great stereo system everywhere. And that's going to be way better. And in fact, what they report in our part of the world anyway, is that the people that have the highest commuter satisfaction is cyclists. So I think some of this is really about actually finding ways to make simple transitions in the city that could be seen as temporary, right? I mean, that's one of the things that can then be, let's say they're a disaster, then you just unpack them and change them again. I mean, if it's simple as paint lines on the roads. So part of it is, I think, making quick moves, using evidence to understand, and people will start to accept it. The other thing I think we do very poorly is, in Vancouver, and I'm sure Viren will be very familiar with this, we have very engaged kind of public communication culture where people show up at City Hall and bang their fists about things all the time. I don't want social housing next to me in my neighborhood. And part of the challenge in that is we often don't unpack these things afterwards and say, well, we allowed this development to go on without parking. And everybody said it was going to be a disaster. I wasn't going to be able to park my car, 10 meters from my house anymore. And we don't go back and say whether that's actually true. This is where I go back to the thing of evidence-based. Let's unpack it. Let's say what actually contributes. Like, for example, there's no evidence whatsoever in our part of the world that social housing affects property values negatively at all. In fact, there's some evidence that affects property values slightly positively, right? So this is where we have to kind of balance public input and evidence input in a kind of mutually respectful way.
Yeah, I think those are great points. Viren, what can we use design to nudge the community towards more healthier and sustainable choices?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in many ways, when you think about a change, change is constant. Things can keep evolving, and when you think about change management, in many ways, I feel technology is the easier bit of it. It's more social behavior change. The pandemic is a good example right now. It's on top of people's mind. Social distancing and the implication it has. But at the same time, when you think about stresses and what cities are going through over a period of time, these things keep evolving, keep changing. So I would say that I think the first thing is, how do we, as whether we are designers, we are from the city or from developers or anybody, I think how do we actually help to bring that social behavior change? I think that is probably, I would say, the spine, and the design definitely is the forefront of it, kind of impacting that change. The second thing I would say is, short-term solutions versus long-term benefits. So again, just thinking about, right now, people are really worried about using transit. And, if you shy away from transit, it'll have, huge impact on transit, like whether it's, ridership, leads to financing and so on and so forth. So while we have the pandemic, I'm not saying that it's dangerous, and everyone is facing that. It's really very scary and traumatic. But at the same time, there are things that'll stay beyond the pandemic, which is like climate emergency, climate change. So the decisions that we take, the priorities we put in place has a huge impact on the long term. So I think just kind of keeping that, the short term versus the long term in mind, it'll really help us to, design cities. When I say design, it's, co-design, and, really think about the frameworks, not necessarily the physical design, move forward in a more holistic manner.
There was a study which outlined that you have 50% more chances of developing diabetes if you were in a community that was car-centric, instead of a community that was walkable, bikeable, or mass transit-driven. So, in a way, your health is embedded in the way your city is designed. So I think in places like India, where we are still developing our infrastructure, and in some ways investing in the worst types of infrastructure like cars, these are important messages to kind of push forward. And I think as design community, we need to frame our conversations around these very crucial health outcomes to the policy choices and investments that we will be making. And I keep saying the constant point that I keep hearing from all the investors and the economists is unlimited QE, which means that the central banks around the world are going to be printing unlimited money to get out of this huge crisis, and we can maybe push that towards the right agenda instead of what we used to do before COVID.
Yeah.
And that's why this conversation is so important. So, just want to really thank you both for outlining that big message, because I think for me, the idea of well-being and health should be at the center of the recovery plan. And I think it's important to link it to the idea of sustainability, right, Lucy?
Yeah, absolutely. It has to be at the center. Now, are we going to call for audience questions at this point?
Yes, I mean, we have hi Camilla. We have Camilla Chapella who's sharing some inputs with us, and she says we as designers should be brave to serve as public officials and understand that there is no such thing as the government, but human beings with different interests. She says we need to put feet in the code's implementation to put great design in the public agenda. I think Camilla point taken on that. I think that's very important. And I want to say hello to the amazing community that's joining us from Urbanista, Architecture Foundation, and the Urban Vision. Let us know if you have any questions, and we'll make sure to ask Viren and Bruce to answer some of them.
I just want to jump in, Prathima, and really support the point that your last contributor made, because one of the things I think has been a real challenge in the architecture world is that what's seen as success is actually very narrow. And I always contrast it, for example, with the legal community. It's totally acceptable to go and get a law degree and become a politician or a businessman or anything like that. And in architecture, there's actually a very narrow range of what's considered to be really successful. You're supposed to be running a kind of design-oriented practice, either in big. And I do think that the importance of architects and designers really starting to step into public service to help shape the conversation is really critical and happens too rarely. I think in Canada, for example, we have never had a single architect elected to the national parliament, which I think is a tragedy.
Yeah, we need more architects in positions of politics. I think we also had only a handful of mayors who were architects, and we tend to celebrate them. I think there's Jaime Lerner from Curitiba, George Ferguson, whom we all love. He was an architect and became the mayor of Bristol. At least we need to start seeing politics and politicians who are architects, at least at the city level to start with.
Jamie Lerner has a fabulous story. I met him in Curitiba once. My wife was actually an exchange student when she was 16 in Curitiba. We went to visit and we got to meet Jamie Lerner. And he has a wonderful story about actually pedestrianizing a major downtown street. And he went to his director of public works and he says, I want you to do this to basically completely take all the cars off the street and change the traffic direction. I want you to do this in 24 hours. And the guy says, I absolutely can't do it. It's going to take me 6 weeks. And then he goes away, and then the director of public works comes back in. Jamie Lerner says, I want you to do it in 24 hours. And he says, no, I've now figured out I can do it in 4 weeks. And so he goes back and he works with the mayor, and Jamie Lerner says to him, I want you to do it in 24 hours. And he finally gazed up. He says, okay, how about 36 hours? And he said, yes, you can do that. And he did it. So he actually did 48. He managed to close down an entire downtown street that had formerly been a traffic artery and completely pedestrianize it over a weekend.
Wow. Yeah. That's an amazing story.
Okay, so while we're waiting for the audience questions, let me move on to that question that we were just about to ask beforehand, which the whole issue of environmental sustainability is one that a lot of private sector developers and public authorities are taking way more seriously. I know in the UK, where I live, local authorities, one after the other, are declaring climate emergencies, but they also have increasing numbers of new environmental sustainability plans. So many design features which enhance health and well-being absolutely bring positive environmental benefits. So what is the connection between health and environmental sustainability?
Viren, you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. I can do that. So I think absolutely, often good design that upholds health and well-being also brings positive social, environmental, and economic benefits. That's what we believe in. For instance, and I'll just probably take two examples that maybe just fundamental, just kind of thinking about it. One is just thinking about shallow building floor plates. We know that having floor plates that are shallower do enable more natural ventilation and light, but also reduces energy requirements and enhances productivity, right? So there is a connection between that. The second example I would say is, again, very, very simple, but very important. Thinking about a balcony, right? Like a simple balcony. It's a simple element, really plays a large role in health and well-being in multiple ways, especially the pandemic has kind of shown that. Provides an opportunity for occupants to enjoy really a healthy time outside, enjoying the convenience and privacy, opportunity to grow plants and grow own food, place for outdoor activity or exercise. When I'm just giving an example, if whether it's pandemic or not, there is this choice that you offer, place for outdoor activity and exercise. You can think about even, providing shade and a quiet place of solitude and respite. And again, we often talk about, social isolation in especially high-rise environment. And Bruce mentioned that previously in the earlier part of the discussion. How do we actually use these different elements? The other thing that it does is, which we all appreciate, is the ability to connect with nature. Air, trees, plants, birds. Views in whatever way you're thinking about, but also the ability to kind of connect with the public life. A sense of connectivity with the larger community. And then the last is, the ability to kind of interact with neighbors. Now, if you think about all these, aspects that I brought up, it is related back to, social part of it. There's environmental part of it, there's economic part of it, and how do we actually create that kind of, I would say, an approach that really, I would say, offers people a better life. It really improves their livability and reduces the stress. Whether it's like physical or mental stress, which is actually a bigger issue in a lot of cities that we look at. How do we actually enable that?
And just to build on what Viren is, I do think it's sometimes important also to call out that in my opinion, there's a fundamental disconnect between in almost all of the global cities in the world between what sells real estate and what actually keeps people happy. If you think about how the private real estate market works, it's often predicated on a belief that what will keep us happy is isolation and control and status. And in fact, it's completely clear that isolation and control and status don't keep us happy, that one of the critical things to keep us happy is actually connection with other people. And connection with other people is harder to market, except in a very generic way. So this is why we see all these advertisements that are actually about the fact that you're going to be way up in your tower, away from people, with a concierge in your giant space that you never need to leave, and you just sit there and wait for your Amazon deliveries to go. And that is seen as highly desirable and highly expensive. Whereas a place where, for example, in my own condominium complex, we have a shared backyard, which means my kids can go wander and knock on anybody's door and anything. And that is extremely difficult to market. In fact, in many cases, it would be concretely illegal.
Yes, I can well believe that. And as you were speaking, it evoked the image of the Dutch Woonhof, the shared street, shared spaces. I mean, communal, some people would maybe feel communal is going too far. But I mean, the fact is that shared spaces can be designed in very intelligent ways. It is really fundamental to our mental health that we see others around us, and we see other citizens, and respond to them. Who designed the gated community? I can't think who came up with that concept.
Well, and it's kind of a manifestation of fear, and I think that architects have to be really resistant. I mean, again, we've managed to avoid using the Trump word in this context. But if you look at what's happening, is that there is a significant group of people in the city who believe that there's a political gain to be made by making people afraid of the city and afraid of their neighbors. And that's an absolute catastrophe that we all have to fight very hard against.
Yes, totally agree. Prathima?
Yeah, I think this has been such an important and fascinating conversation. And I really, really think that, Lucy, the heart of the Urban Manifesto has to be about this agenda, because it has such huge implications. I think we all have to recognize that this moment, which is very strange, odd, and a huge humanitarian crisis, almost feels like a preview to the climate emergency that scientists have spoken about for a long time. And, this pandemic has, in a way, amplified the flaws of our economic and development model. And it's especially, emphasize the lack of understanding of how human health, natural environment, and built environment interact with each other, and how they, have an impact on health outcomes and our quality of life. And I hope that challenge can be the heart of the, revival plan. We have a comment from Camilla again. And let us know, everyone, if you have questions, please share it in the video link below and we'll try to take it. Camilla Chapela, she's from Tampa, Florida. She asks us, could we organize a webinar with developers? It would be great to know if they see any hope for happiness over profit, as Bruce said.
Well, that's a perfect cue, Camilla, to tell you that next week's episode is going to be called Creating a New Piece of City, Meridian Water. And we are looking at the £7 billion flagship development project of Enfield Council, a local developer in London, Meridian Water. We have the program director and the head of placemaking, Peter George and Lisa Wu, and we will precisely be talking about their very progressive strategies, including their environmental sustainability strategy, which is about the triple bottom line of social, economic and environmental, as Viren was talking about earlier on. So that's we always plug next week's episode. So thank you for anticipating that.
Yeah, and I think, and we've engaged with developers in the past, and we need to continue to do that. And we are also planning a session on sustainable finance, which, and it's been interesting to see funds which are thinking about triple bottom line and not just profit. So I think let's hope that becomes the majority and not just a small group, but it's important to put a spotlight on them.
Yeah, just to kind of add to that conversation, I'm just thinking that the current pandemic has really given us an opportunity, right, to rethink about that. And I think the Urban Manifesto is a great, platform. I'm also thinking that, cities are, co-designed. It's a great opportunity. One is the developer side of it, but I think it's a great opportunity for all, whether cities and municipalities to be, stewards, ask for the right thing, whether it's codes, practices, standards. Owners and developers to redefine the bottom line. That's what we are talking about right now, and the community to actually ask for the right things. And again, that's about awareness and really empowering the communities that we work in. And lastly, for designers to really lead the charge in rethinking and bring positive change. So in many ways, I feel it's about co-design. It's like everybody has to play a role. At the same time, individually, all of us have a responsibility and a role to play in building better cities.
Well said.
Yeah, I completely agree. Co-creation is absolutely fundamental, and Prathima and I have given some considerable attention, including last week under tactical urbanism, the heading, which we include as part of which we included participatory placemaking. You do regeneration with communities, not for communities. So yes, at every scale. And I think, as Prathima said, this tragic pandemic has revealed so many vulnerabilities and insecurities and precarities within all our societies. We really need to take on board absolutely every single observation that people have made about what is not working, because a lot of it was not working before, and it's just revealed it so much. So it's been an enthralling conversation, very, very profound and thoughtful. Prathima, so last words?
Do we have time to take one last question? Because we have one.
Oh, yes.
We can maybe quickly take that. Roop asks, the beginning of history of urban planning goes back to the need to create hygienic and healthy cities. How is it that contemporary urban planning pays less attention to well-being and health?
Oh, that's a great one. We should both jump in on this one. Viren, you want to start?
Is that actually true?
Yeah, I mean, I can take a shot at this. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Roop. The whole idea about separation and kind of really upholding the health and well-being of people, kind of separated. Unfortunately, it had negative issues, right? So we started designing cities, separating the users completely. That had actually it's got a negative connotation, right? Because right now we have more greenhouse gases. The VMTs are higher in vehicle miles traveled. There are all these stresses that we have exerted on a well-functioning system, that we have kind of separated the users. And I think right now, as urban designers and planners and architects, we're really and working with cities, we're really trying to build more mixed-use communities. And again, it's like the 20-minute neighborhood that we talk about, where you're not forced to get into a car to get a gallon of milk or a loaf of bread. You can walk to it. So I think you're absolutely right. I think there has been that kind of a deviation, and I think it's the second aspect to that is that all of us have become really I would say interested in efficiency, right? So everything has to be efficient. We instant gratification. You send an email, you want a response immediately. I think that also has an impact on how we're thinking about cities. So again, in one of the agendas on the manifesto, I talked about is generosity. I think as cities are becoming smart and buildings are becoming smart, our public spaces are becoming really poor. And we're not doing a good job with that. So I think again, thinking about this in a more holistic way, where we can really up the game in all aspects, and therefore health and well-being, which unfortunately was kind of relegated only to the program and use as opposed to intent, has been lost. I think, yes, you're absolutely right. I think we need to kind of rejig that, recalibrate that. This is a great opportunity for all of us, because it's created a common playing field across the whole globe. It's not only one country or a city, and I think this is an opportunity for us to really up the game.
And I think, just to add to that, I think one of the issues with cities, I think cities, and I'm super passionate about it. I think one of the things that they have accelerated, though, I think they've accelerated income inequality. Like, if you think about it, the global cities, like, Lucy, you're in London. I mean, the last time I was in London, which was many, many years since I lived there, it was absolutely visible, the dramatic shift in terms of the people who had enormous amounts of resources and the people who had far, far less. And I think one of the things the pandemic has brought into focus, hopefully to good end, is that there are certain kinds of aspects of health that we all do genuinely share, that even if you're the wealthiest person, yes, some of them will be able to head off to their yachts and completely get away, but ultimately they're going to have to come back at some point, right? And so I think that there is this aspect about cities that we also have to be honest that cities in part have tended to accelerate some things. And I think a wealth and particularly income inequality and a health and wellness focus is a way of contradicting that in a positive way.
Yeah, this was so great, and I thank both of you for spending this hour with us, outlining the agenda for this very important topic. Lucy?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, the emphasis on other values beyond the commercial and the economic, beyond the profit issue, is so fundamental at this point. Yeah. So it was
good for all of us too. Like, this is the thing; it's actually good for all of us.
For absolutely all of us. It's such a rewarding conversation, and we could have this conversation 50 times over and still not fully, draw out all the issues. I think it is really great to have this experience. So thank you so much for being with us today, and I hope the audience, everybody out there, enjoyed listening to a theme that we are going to have to return to. We may even put it on the agenda for another 5 weeks' time, because listening to what you both had to say, it reminded me that we do need to come back to some subjects are never finished. How about another session, Prathima?
Yes, I think we really need that.
And that's a strand within every single topic. Every episode deals with health and well-being to some extent. Definitely, we do take a very holistic approach.
Yeah, thanks again for joining us, and join us every Tuesday at the same time as we discuss important agendas for the future of built environment and cities. And if you're on Facebook, like us, so you can, and if you're on YouTube, subscribe to us so you can get a reminder of the next few sessions. Stay well and stay safe. We will see you soon. Thank you,
Lucy.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.